How to Hide a Body. Burying and Unearthing Trauma by Ecclesia Baum. Part 1. Death.
Chapter 3. Motive. Why are we the ones with something to hide? We aren't the murderer, we're the murder victim. Murder victims don't handle things that come after the murder. One would think that this would be obvious, but here we are anyway. Victims don't hide their own corpses. We've misunderstood the role that we play in this tragedy. Who do we think we are that we feel like we should deal with everything on our own? The accomplice. A big reason that we don't allow God or anyone else to help us work through our trauma is because we feel guilty. We look back at what happened to us and we decide, fairly or unfairly, that we are to blame, whether completely or in part. We can't press charges because we somehow see ourselves as a perpetrator. Sometimes we feel that way because we were too young to understand what happened. Someone abused us and we assume in our naivete that it was our fault for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was our fault for not crying out for help. It was our fault for not running away. It was our fault for not behaving. It was our fault for talking to a stranger. It was our fault for panicking and forgetting important advice. It was our fault for being a part of something bad. For those of us who are emotionally abused or neglected, we link the offenses against us to our own personal flaws. For those of us who are victims of sexual abuse, assault, or harassment as a child, we don't want to tell anyone because we feel ashamed of being involved in something we understand to be inappropriate, and we consider ourselves immoral at worst and tainted at best. For those of us who experienced horror or terror, seeing or hearing or being too close to a tragedy or surviving a disaster, we can feel ashamed of how small we were and how weak we were, or how unintelligent or unprepared we were, and we consider ourselves to be always a step behind. The development of our mind is so linear and so gradual that we can be blind to the fact that the conscious person we were when we were younger didn't have the same abilities and resources as the conscious person we are now, even if they are the same person on different ends of a timeline. The person we are now, looking back on what happened, has more information and experience than the person we were back then. Especially when we're young, but sometimes even as adults, we don't have the vocabulary to discuss what we're feeling, so we tend to internalize everything. We don't know how to say that we've been traumatized by this or that. We only know that we want to cry, and that's not normal or good, or that we're in pain when everyone else seems to be okay, so maybe we're just a wimp. Or that someone told us not to tell, so now we have to be good and not tell. Or that so-and-so said they'd do something bad if we speak up, and of course they can, since they've done something bad to us and gotten away with it before. If we were a child, how can it be our fault? How can child abuse or child neglect be the child's fault? We know it's not rational. If anyone pulled up an article about any given case of child abuse and asked us whether we blame the child who was assaulted or the person who assaulted them, would we ever blame it on the child? If a kid we knew came to us crying and saying they'd been molested, would we tell them it was their fault? If a 13-year-old girl confided in us that a teacher has been sending her inappropriate messages, do we blame the girl for being too pretty, or do we blame the grown adult for being a pervert? Even if a child ran away from home and was lost in the woods for days, would we really blame them for doing it to themselves, or would we understand that kids make mistakes and just be glad they're okay? Kids don't know what adults do. Kids can't defend themselves like adults can. Kids can't consent. Why are we so harsh on our childhood selves? We were just children. Why are we so harsh on our adult selves? We are just human. We say things to ourselves like, I should have escaped when I could. I should have seen it coming. I should have told them no. I should have called for help. I should have fought back. As if we really had a choice at the time, as if that was really an option with the strength and knowledge we had at the time. Just because we're smarter than kids doesn't mean we're all-knowing. Just because we're stronger than kids doesn't mean we're invincible. Just because we are in an age of consent doesn't mean that we will be honored. It is true that we can only control our actions and that we need to take responsibility for our actions. It is true that we put ourselves in dangerous places sometimes. It is even true that we do bad things. Sometimes we do very bad things that threaten the lives of others, so it's understandable that someone may threaten ours back. But unless we were posing an immediate threat to another, even our actions don't necessarily make us responsible for another's reaction to us. Sometimes people willfully and disproportionately hurt us, and we turn our actions leading up to that moment into excuses for their misdeeds. But would we do what they did? If someone was drunk and helpless, would we take advantage of them, or would we give them a safe place to recover, or at least leave them alone? If we realized someone was lying to us, would we take out the baseball bat, or would we talk it out, or at least walk away? If we see someone objectifying themselves by wearing a skimpy outfit, do we rape them, or do we try to respect them as a human? If someone slapped us in the face, would we make sure they could never walk again? Even if we knew we were going somewhere where the people were monsters, the people are still to blame for being monsters. People aren't animals. People aren't sharks that their appetites at the scent of blood should be justified. People are accountable for themselves. There were other options that the person who hurt us could have taken. There are kinder options that we ourselves would have taken if we were in a similar situation, even without the first-hand knowledge of the havoc one could wreak on another's life. A decent person at least has a sense of altruism, if not a set of morals. A decent person doesn't pick the most malicious option. Even less than decent people have standards. Even jerks usually settle for being rude than dealing critical damage. If we did the things that were done to us, we'd take all the blame that we could. But for some reason, we feel like the blame for the things that were done to us rests only on us. We only know how to blame ourselves. Then, because we feel so strongly that we have to be accountable for our own selves, we fail to reach out for help. We accept all suffering as our punishment for our ignorance or mistakes or misdeeds. Maybe we feel like we should have been physically stronger. Maybe we feel like we should have been more vigilant. Maybe we beat ourselves up because, despite our mental terror, our body still reacted with arousal. Maybe we beat ourselves up because all we had to do was say something or move away, but we froze. We dissociated. Maybe we think we should have felt more. We belittle ourselves until we accept fault, even though it isn't our weight to carry. Our inability to put our own situation into perspective isn't the only reason we may heap the blame on ourselves. The people that hurt us aren't always strangers. They are often people we know, people we love. Because they were close, we trusted them. Because they were close, they were in a position to hurt us, and they did. Because they were close, we can't bring ourselves to blame them. We make excuses for them because we love them, and we can't bring ourselves to look at them differently. They are still our friends. They are still our spouses. They are still our parents. We treat them very nearly with forgiveness, actually, and it's not bad to forgive, so what's the problem? The problem is we give them more mercy than we will give ourselves. They broke our trust, so why are we who trusted at fault? For the sake of their reputation in the eyes of others? For the sake of their reputation in our eyes? Do we want so badly to idealize them that we can overlook something that caused us so much suffering, that we can pretend to be fine like nothing ever happened and internalize all of our pain, all for them to have a normal life and peace of mind? I'm not advocating for vengeance, but we are responsible for our own souls and our own salvation, and we are crippling ourselves when we take the full blame of another. We are not really looking at them with forgiveness because we didn't blame them. We forbear forgiveness by ignoring the debt. Instead of trying to keep the blame on the perpetrator and finding a way to forgive them as God intended, we've turned their offense into an unforgivable sin and then pretend it never happened. There is nothing wrong with acknowledging that the person you love hurt you. Our forgiveness is meaningless until we acknowledge the wrong perpetrated against us. It is so powerful to say to someone, I know everything that you did to me and that it was wrong, and I forgive you. But we don't want to say that. What we're actually saying is, if you had hurt me like that, I could never forgive you. It's a good thing you never did something like that. It almost reads like a threat. The forgiveness we're issuing to them is predicated upon our outright denial of any wrongdoing, and it's implied that if we were ever to fully recognize their trespass, our forgiveness would become void. We often prove how unforgivable it is by refusing to forgive ourselves for the part we think that we played. Any supposed forgiveness we have for them loses its impact, and because our forgiveness has stipulations, because we don't truly forgive, we don't find peace. We may have the most honorable of intentions when we take their blame like this. Perhaps we are doing it so that they have the freedom to return to church and give their hearts to God. Do we really think they are going to make their way to God without acknowledging what they've done to us? Unless they've suffered some sort of memory loss, one of the steps they will have to take in order to reconcile with God is to recognize that they've hurt us. If God Himself acknowledges their sin before forgiving it, why do we feel the need to ignore or own the sin of another before giving them a clean slate? God didn't mean for us to live like this. The act of turning the other cheek is not just powerful because it signifies forgiveness and fearlessness, but because it signifies these things while also acknowledging the first slap. God meant for us to acknowledge the sins of others and then forgive. That doesn't necessarily mean walking up to an abuser and saying to them, "You hurt me, but I forgive you." We can, if that gives us closure, but that isn't always wise or safe. We do, however, need to be able to acknowledge within ourselves, to admit to ourselves and to God that they did hurt us, and then make peace with that in our heart so that it no longer controls us. The love of people isn't perfect. We don't need to lie to ourselves just so the misdeeds of our loved ones line up with our image of them, especially at the expense of our mental health. Maybe they loved us as best as they know how, and they just didn't have a lot of know-how. It's not okay, but these things happen. Maybe they lied to us. Maybe it was never love. When we confront the reality of our situation, it is difficult to figure out the difference between poorly executed love and fake love, and it's so much simpler to just blame ourselves. We already know we don't love ourselves after all. Still, we do need to take the steps to understand, or we'll always be unable to distinguish the difference. Our delusions of what love is and what love is supposed to be will continue to make us vulnerable to future pain. Even when there is no one to blame, we still blame ourselves. We are the only variable that we can identify in the situation. No one put us in this position. We did. No one distracted us at the critical moment. Our mind just wandered on its own. It had to have been our fault. And if it hadn't been for us, we tell ourselves, none of this would have happened. If we had heeded the warnings, we wouldn't have been caught in the storm. If we had seen the signals, we wouldn't have been injured. If we had been there like we were meant to be, no one would have died. But sometimes things just happen. Inconsequential, impartial, random variables intersect by chance, and we just happened to be there when the straw broke the camel's back. Every choice and action that led to our downfall, there was no way for anyone to predict it. It's like trying to understand an avalanche. Why did we get caught when it all came crashing down back then? It was because of the weather that year, because of each wind current that brought the snow to the mountain, because of each snowflake that haphazardly landed on the ground, and because of the ground that welcomed them, because of the mountain that caught the snowstorm, because no one stopped us from going to the mountain, because something was a little too loud that day, because we were too many steps too close, because just enough of the snow and ice failed to keep its place, because the way that the mountains were formed led the snow downhill to us. And even though our icy grave was caused by all of these things, it was at the same time the fault of no single thing. It wouldn't have mattered if there was a loud sound if just a little less snow had fallen before, if we were just a little further away, or if the grooves in the mountain shielded us. It wouldn't matter if the avalanche fell. If the weather had been different last season, it wouldn't matter if we were there or not. Some of these factors seem more within our control than others, but the ignorant don't have control. We are not gods. We don't have the benefit of perfect foresight, and we can't judge ourselves based on our imperfect hindsight. As humans, we always want to find someone to take accountability because we want someone to pay, and we want to believe that people aren't at the mercy of a short and troublesome life. If it's our fault, then we don't need to acknowledge that things happen outside of our control. We turn situations that we couldn't do anything about into multiple choice tests that we have failed, because we'd rather say we have power that we failed to use than say we were powerless. We would rather take blame than lose any sense of agency. Nonetheless, things go wrong even without our help, and there isn't always someone at fault. Things just happen, and some things were going to happen no matter what we did. It's scary to admit it, but sometimes things are so far out of man's control that it doesn't matter what we choose in those moments. No amount of penance on our part can redeem what happened because it was a blameless tragedy. We did our best. Things just happen. Sometimes we don't blame ourselves for what we think we've done, but what we think we are, an unworthy survivor. When we are involved in a tragedy and see someone else take the brunt of it, we can't shake the feeling that it should have been us. This is survivor's guilt. We feel like we were the weak ones, we were the inferior ones, we were no greater than the ones who were lost. So why are we the ones who walked away relatively unscathed? We torture ourselves with guilt and grief and refuse to let ourselves move on. They didn't move on. They didn't even have the chance to move on, so why do we get to? Their dreams were stolen from them, so why do we get to pursue our mediocre dreams with our mediocre talent? They are scarred for life, so why should our wounds heal? Their beautiful lives ended that day, so why do we get to keep living? We can't stand the thought, so we punish ourselves. Maybe we refuse to move forward in life and try to mourn every day like it's the day we lost the other person. Or maybe we abandon opportunities for growth and happiness in one-sided solidarity with the other person. Or maybe we put immense pressure on ourselves to carry out the work that was cut short. In a way, we are still blaming ourselves, even if we know there was nothing we could have done differently. We are still taking responsibility for things that weren't our responsibility. We are still hurting ourselves and refusing to move on. It's one thing for a person to inspire us and to spur us into action, but it's another thing to live on punishing ourselves for another's pain or death that we aren't responsible for. In a way, we insult their loss. Really, nothing can make what happened better for them. It's great if we can make meaning out of it, for our own sake, but if they aren't the ones making meaning out of it for themselves, then it doesn't help them. Our parade of penance doesn't make up for their inability to move forward. Our misuse of the life that we've been given doesn't make up for the loss of theirs. A man who has food doesn't cause the hungry man to go hungry, nor does he comfort him by fasting. The illusion of guilt and solidarity only comforts us and no one else, because even though it doesn't make anyone happy or relieve any stress, it at least makes us feel like we're doing something. Much of what I have said to this point is in our own defense. But it is a fact that we do things to ourselves in ignorance, in error, in arrogance, intoxicated, intentional, in a sound mind, in a clear conscience, that are ethically indefensible. Just as we break our own hand punching a wall or eat until we're sick, just as we can injure ourselves physically, we can hurt ourselves emotionally. We can make a foolish decision while driving and get in an accident that causes us to struggle with PTSD. We can start the fight and have nightmares of the beating. We can make rash decisions that harm people around us in ways that we can't predict. We can be the disasters for which we also feel survivor's guilt. We are people, and we don't always do the right thing. Sometimes we do the convenient thing, or the easiest thing, or the most gratifying thing. Even with knowledge and understanding and morals and ethics, even with the Spirit of God dwelling in us, we don't always do the right thing. Living with the knowledge that we are the ones who did this to ourselves is difficult because it makes us feel undeserving of help. We start to believe in a way that the suffering is penance, as if we're some tragic hero. There is also some element of pride. The notion that we did this to ourselves, so we should be the one to fix ourselves. We act as if there's no difference between accountability and beating ourselves up. There is a difference. Beating ourselves up is restraining ourselves to a place of shame and lowliness in acknowledgement of something that we've done, but accountability is understanding what happened and making it right. We are not making it right if we're not moving on. We justify treating ourselves in a subhuman manner and acting in ways that benefit no one and edify no one and inspire no one. We're trapping ourselves in a place of constant and unnecessary self-punishment instead of moving on to learn from our mistakes and becoming something greater. And this is an injustice to ourselves, to the people around us, and to God. How can the light of God shine through us like this? Living with the knowledge that we are the ones who did this to ourselves and to others is difficult because we place ourselves in vague standing with others. We are unable to set boundaries anymore. On one hand, we play the role of victim because we are in pain. On the other hand, we play the role of the eternal debtor plagued by unending guilt. These mixed roles and their mixed emotions cause us to be enabling. The people we feel guilt towards, we let them get away with anything, And we won't stop them because we feel as though we owe them something, or we feel as though we have no right, or we feel as though they are justified in acting this way because of the way that we traumatize them. But know this: enabling creates monsters. One day, the people that we enable will question even the lenient boundary that we've set for them, and they will invade. Giving them too much teaches them to take too much, and they'll do exactly as they're taught. We enabled them, but we didn't help them. We didn't prune their branches when they encroached on us or on others, and now they'll grow out of control and into the territory of others until they can't sustain their own weight. Maybe we did traumatize them, but everyone needs boundaries. We need boundaries. We can still enable ourselves when push comes to shove. Sometimes guilt causes people to become pliant, but guilt is often a point of contention for the guilty. Guilt is something that we often run from, and not just our perceived guilt from our trauma, but any pang of guilt. If we feel guilty about anything, we panic. We make every excuse we can, change our focus to support our argument, lean into any narrative that absolves us. We might even know deep down that our stubbornness is a front that is pushing people away. But guilt is a funny thing. It hurts too much to admit we were wrong when we know just how terrifyingly wrong we can be. And any guilt we feel for anything else comes with a frightening uncertainty because of the way we've left the guilt from what we consider to be our greatest failure unaddressed. We don't know what will happen to us if we own up to our mistakes, whether past or present. Let's say we come clean. What if the people we traumatized hate us and throw it in our face? What if society or the people around us scrutinize our actions and decide that we are disqualified from restoration? We don't allow that. We tell ourselves that if we run far enough, we'll escape scrutiny, or if we give enough leeway, then we'll do enough good deeds to outweigh our bad deeds. We are so proud, thinking that we can keep everything under control by dancing around the issue for the rest of our lives, but we can't just hokey pokey and turn this one around. David is a truly amazing person because the same man that committed adultery with Bathsheba and murdered her husband to cover it up is the same man that was said to be after God's own heart. It's not because God innately favors adulterers and murderers, but it's because David was not too proud to achieve true accountability. When the prophet Nathan told him that he was the man, David had the humbleness to repent. But what if David had doubled down on trying to hide his guilt? He had already gone through great lengths to get Uriah out of the way, deceiving messengers, breaking Israel's trust in his competence as a leader by choosing to send his troops along the wall knowing that it was a bad strategy, sacrificing loyal soldiers that weren't even Uriah and had nothing to do with Uriah as if they were mere pawns, all just to orchestrate a situation in which Uriah would die. What's another lie after all that? David, you're the man. It wasn't intentional. I didn't realize Uriah would actually die like that. You are the man. Joab was the one who was actually there. He knew the situation better. Why didn't he help? Really, it's his fault. You are the man. It wasn't my sword. This was just fate. Not everyone died. It's just a coincidence that Uriah did. I just lost a faithful and irreplaceable soldier. How dare you accuse me? You don't understand the position I'm in, the decisions I have to make. If David kept denying it, there would be no kingship for David because God would reject him as he did Saul. There would be no legacy for David and his son Solomon because Solomon would not be as wise as he was without the wisdom of David, or he would be wise in spite of David and would exist as a counterpoint to the sins of his father. It would be the house of Solomon instead of the house of David. But David knew he was the man, and he knew that things had spiraled out of control, from an affair to a cover-up to a murder to a military defeat that affected the entire kingdom. It is better to just stop before things get worse. He realized that there are worse things than admitting guilt. Guilt, that is, the state of being an offender, is not as bad as we think it is. We are the ones who make it unbearable. Guilt is not a call to action or a social construct or a sentencing. Guilt is a fact, and anything beyond that fact that we may attach to it is secondary. If a man is guilty of a crime and he is exonerated, what does his guilt mean? If a man is responsible for theft but no one presses charges, what does his guilt mean? If a man commits all but the sin of blasphemy of the Holy Ghost and God remits it all, what does his guilt mean? Even if it is our sins that traumatize us, God didn't call for us to pay for our own sin. Are we not repentant? Isn't that why we drive ourselves crazy and act in such extreme ways? Because we feel bad? God has plenty of mercy, even for us. If God forgives us, we need to forgive ourselves. God meant for us to forgive ourselves too. We're only human. How long do we intend to perpetuate guilt? We are not perfect judges. We are biased and driven by our preconceptions, insecurities, and fears. We don't know how to properly mete out blame, especially when it comes to ourselves. We need to stop making our lives more painful by accepting the verdicts of incompetent judges like ourselves. If God himself doesn't blame us, then why are we trying so hard to blame ourselves? Can't we just make peace with our powerlessness? Can't we come to terms with the fact that the person we were yesterday was not perfect, and that the person we are today can do nothing about it but to try to learn from it? Wouldn't it be great to be kind to ourselves and to stop making ourselves carry the weight of sins we didn't commit or the weight of sins that God already forgave? The public figure. When we've prided ourselves on our strength, it is jarring when we're suddenly made weak. We cannot bear to view ourselves as vulnerable, as anything less than the pillar of strength we see ourselves as, and we don't want others to see us this way too. This matters a lot to us, but why? Maybe we think that our victimhood destabilizes us. We are in a place of power, and our trauma is a chink in our armor, a weak point that can be exploited. There was once a time when our reputation had been airtight, and we were able to avoid things like scandal and drama. Now we find ourselves in a place where we have to deal with emotions that we've never dealt with, emotions that we're bad at dealing with, and it undermines the routine and the duties of our position. When we are in a leadership position, that position is already naturally insecure, whether or not we acknowledge it. Leadership puts us in a place of greater accountability and greater scrutiny, and sometimes that scrutiny is from people who wish for our failure and hope to see us replaced in ways that favor their agendas. We were already in a place where we were walking on eggshells, and now we have to do it with extra weight on our shoulders. We were already targets, but at least we were moving targets. And we think if we stop even for a moment to deal with our feelings, we won't even be that. Maybe we think that victimhood delegitimizes our philosophies. Perhaps it represents a failure to heed our own advice. We always warned against putting ourselves in situations like this or letting people use us, and now here we are. Or perhaps it could represent counter-evidence against the way we used to view and approach the concept of trauma before we really understood it. We were not always so understanding towards people dealing with depression or PTSD or anxiety, etc. And now that the shoe fits us too, we're trying not to limp like others do in order to prove a point. We want to be seen as correct, no matter the personal cost. Perhaps we feel like our position as a nurturer is delegitimized by our needs. We were always the shoulder to cry on, and we fear that if we let our shoulders droop, we can't continue to be that place of security for someone else. We are parents or teachers or mentors, or we're the one in our friend group who is considered to be emotionally stable, and we feel the need to continue to appear emotionally stable. Just because we have a wound that we need to deal with doesn't mean that everyone puts their pain on hold. People don't take turns hurting. We push our needs aside and prioritize the needs of others so that we can continue to be a rock for someone else. We keep putting off our pain and hoping that it doesn't catch up to us. We are considered the strong one, and we'll go to great lengths to make sure everyone continues to see us that way. Maybe our victimhood offends us, showing us new sides of ourselves that contradict our self-image. We thought we were smarter than this. How did we fall victim to something so stupid? We thought we were invincible. How did something like this take us out? We used to coast through problems. We used to bounce right back. And we believed that it was because of our own resilience and not because we'd never seen a real storm before or because we took the strength of our youth for granted. There had never been an injury before that we couldn't recover from on our own. We saw ourselves as strong enough to protect ourselves. We invested so much into our own strength and wits and preparedness, and we can't handle the fact that maybe none of that mattered. But rather than fixate on the notion that all we did could have been for naught, we cover our wounds and pretend we were never defeated. For some reason, we need to believe that we're stronger than the victim we became, that we're as strong as we always were. The reason is pride. We idealize and elevate ourselves to a level of superhumanity. We don't usually see others that we consider victims as being less than human. Indeed, we are able to feel real sympathy, even empathy for them, but we see ourselves as greater. What makes us greater than someone else? What makes us the first human in the history of humanity to be above all of the pain and suffering of life? In a world of people who understandably and inevitably need to rely on others and on God, why are we the exception? Pain is only a stigma to the proud, and vulnerability is only a weakness to the insecure. In actuality, pain and vulnerability are tools that the brave and the confident use to connect with other people and to propel themselves forward. Because our own self-esteem is so unstable, we fail to master pain and vulnerability and instead use all of our energy trying to erase these aspects of our lives. Even though we think that we're doing it to help others by giving them an idealized version of ourselves to rely on, we push others away because we don't admit how deeply we understand them. Even though we think we are making ourselves look stronger, we are only making ourselves look shallower. We look like a caricature of strength instead of a fully fleshed human. Or, even worse, we unintentionally convince the people who look up to us that they should be like us. They see our facade of strength and believe it to be real strength, and in turn they strain to fit that misguided ideal. Do we really want them to be like us? Do we really want them to be injured, repressed, over-encumbered fools like we are? As expected, when we chose to preserve our pride rather than our souls, the pain is never resolved. We don't want our pain to even be identified, much less be ministered to. We deny ourselves the necessity of a shoulder to cry on and a heart to confide in and an altar to kneel at. And we only worsen our pain until we break. We often say that pride comes before the fall, that when we are proud, we will be humbled and removed from the position of authority or trust that we hold. We get it in our heads that the only thing at stake is the position that we're trying to protect, so we don't worry. How could we lose our position if we're being so vigilant and taking it so seriously? However, pride comes before the fall is a misquote. The Bible says pride cometh before destruction. We are not just jeopardizing some kind of position when we refuse to allow ourselves the freedom of vulnerability and the benefit of help. We are destroying ourselves, and we are endangering everyone who depends on us more than we even realize. The debtor. If a debt didn't have interest, it would not be as overwhelming to repay. Interest is an amount of money the borrower has to pay on top of the original debt, and it is based on the principal amount, or the original loan amount, that is owed. For example, if you have a loan for $100 with no interest, then you only pay $100 back. If you have a loan for $100 and there is interest, you pay more than $100 back. You have to give back more than you've used, and what you have to give back depends on the interest rate and how long you have the loan. Interest often accrues daily, and it's based on the amount you still owe. If you pay the minimum payment every time, you pay all of the interest over the life of the loan. If you pay extra every month towards the principal, the total interest you pay is reduced. If you don't make payments, the money you owe keeps increasing and it becomes even worse than expected. This is a really basic rundown of how loans and interest work because the way interest is actually calculated is borderline sorcery. Still, the same principle stands. If you pay extra now, you pay less over the long run. If you pay the minimum now, you pay more over the long run. If you pay nothing, someday you'll really pay. This is part of the reason it's so hard to get out of debt. I'm not suddenly dispensing financial advice for no reason, although it is good to know. I say all of this because we treat our trauma like a debt sometimes. Even though it costs us more over the long run to do nothing about the debt, it takes less effort in the moment to just ignore it. We stop caring about the effect it has on our credit. We stop caring about how it affects our ability to move up in life. We only know that trying to get rid of the debt is hard and takes resources, and it requires less energy day to day if we just leave it be. If we don't look at the statements, does it really matter? If we ignore the debtors, then does the debt still exist? If we pretend our problems aren't really there, who will prove that it is? We decide to abandon the concept of credit. We don't need to care about buying better cars and living in better houses and all of that. We'll just live by the cash in our pockets. We'll live in what we can manage with our present strength because our present feelings are certain, and the energy we currently have is certain. Now is certain. So why work for a future that is uncertain? Why grapple with a past that is so draining to resolve? We've been living with our various emotionally cheap, instantly gratifying coping methods so long that anything else feels uncomfortable. We're comfortable where we are, with our constant but more or less manageable pain, with living below our means, with always being seen as broken or down and out. It doesn't even bother us anymore. We don't want resolutions, just temporary relief. We just accept that this is the way things are. This is what we can afford right now. We call it acceptance, but really it's a fear of the future. Right now, we understand where we are and know exactly what it takes to eke out a living. We know exactly how many pills we need to take, exactly what lie to tell, exactly what motions to go through. But what if we started over? We'd have to figure everything out again. Change is frightening. What if we fail in a context where we actually have something to lose? What if people actually begin to have expectations for us that we can then let down? What if it takes more strength than we have? We have a little bit of security now, but what if we lose it all? What if trying harder isn't enough to make things better? Why throw all of our precious emotional energy in an out-of-control debt that we may never be able to pay off when we can spend it on something that soothes us now? But the amazing thing is, even though paying off a debt requires more from us in the present, it costs less in the long run. Is it really costing us less emotional energy to spend it all up front on overpriced coping mechanisms for the rest of our lives than to confront our trauma and move on now? We are doing ourselves an injustice by not affording ourselves the opportunity to move on, all for a paltry sense of comfort. We take shelter under the wings of distress and instability, even as it tramples us to death, all because we're scared of the things beyond those wings. The question we never ask ourselves is, what are we going to do if we live long enough to see the consequences of our delinquent self-care? We worry we won't be strong enough to deal with our trauma and rehabilitate, but what if we're not strong enough to keep up what we're doing now? What are we going to do when it becomes a choice between our habits or our relationships, our habits or our health, our habits or our soul? What happens if we die like this? Not all debts die with us, and trauma is the same. If we leave it untreated till we die, the people around us live with the way that our subpar lives have impacted them, and the pain lives on until someone pays it off. Someone will inevitably need to find closure, if not us. We have to become brave enough to confront the debt of pain that has been accumulating in us, because it won't go away any other way. The Martyr. As I've stated in earlier sections, sometimes we don't want to handle our pain correctly because we want to use it to make a statement. Pain and vulnerability are valuable tools in communicating with people. We can use our vulnerability to connect with others and show them that we understand and that we relate to them. It is a beautiful thing to understand someone, and we can grant others a sense of belonging and acceptance when we show them our hearts. But on the other hand, we can be the ones waiting to feel understood, and we may not be patient enough to wait. We use our suffering to send a message. We can't forget our trauma, the ways we were wronged, the burden that was forced onto us, and we refuse to let the world forget it either. We see ourselves as martyrs. We are the wronged innocents, and the world should recognize how we hurt. I'm not saying this isn't true. The innocent are often wronged, and sometimes the world does and should view them as martyrs. But suffering doesn't impart virtue. We can't keep our trauma on life support as a way of taking the supposed moral high ground or as a way of getting attention. It's so hard not to want a little attention, a little tenderness for our wounded hearts and minds, comfort, acknowledgement, gentleness. These are all normal things to want when we're hurting, but we become greedy for them. We feed on attention, but attention alone doesn't bring healing. We gorge on comfort, but comfort alone doesn't repair us. We have to make up our minds to move on, or we won't move on. We can never get to a place where we can live without comfort. We can never get to a place where we feel secure without the attention being on us. We can never become whole enough that we can help someone else. Some of us should be in the place where we can minister to others, but we keep clamoring for someone to minister to us. Some of us should have progressed by now. Sometimes this greed for comfort takes us too far. We act out more and more so that we can scrape up what little pity we can find to our own hurt. Our constant antics and our refusal to move on repel the people around us. We lose credibility. Our wounds are so exaggerated and overhyped that people become desensitized to them and have trouble taking our complaints seriously. We survived the wolf once, but if we keep crying wolf, will we survive the next time? Will we survive when we seek out the wolf intentionally so that we can cry out for help with credibility? Will people always keep coming to check on us when we keep wearing out their trust? We put ourselves in worse and worse situations, damaging ourselves socially, emotionally, spiritually, and physically, and our attempts to get attention become less and less effective. We don't have to be so insecure. We have value outside of our victimhood. We think that this tragedy is our story and it's central to what we are. Yes, it has impacted us in a lot of important ways, but that isn't us. We keep trying to define ourselves by trauma and keep struggling to make this definition of ourselves livable in the narrow parameters of victimhood. But it doesn't work. It's stifling. And all of the things that people do to try to make us feel better never make us feel better. Because we still feel claustrophobic in this little box we've crammed our identity into. Do we always want to be like this, or are we just too scared to do anything else? Do we always want to be in a state of anguish? I didn't have a choice, we say. I didn't have the luxury of choosing. Someone chose a life of pain for me. No. Someone can choose to hurt us, but the life we lead afterward is our choice alone. I don't know another way to live. Learn it. How is it that our pain has made us so self-centered, but we still can't believe in our own ability to do better and to live better? Other people can go through what we have, and yes, horrifyingly enough, other people have gone through what we have and have gone through worse, and they get better. What makes us so uniquely wretched? Do we really enjoy being the one who is always pitiful? Do we really like that our defining feature is how miserable we are and how miserable we make others? Why does our name have to be synonymous with victimhood? How much easier would it be to keep people around us because they enjoy our company rather than because they're afraid of what we'll do if they leave? How much more meaningful would it be if our relationships were built on mutual respect and love instead of how bad the other party feels for us? How much better would it be to have friends instead of hostages? Confidants instead of a captive audience? These are achievable things, no matter how terrible we think we are. If we try, and if we can show ourselves friendly instead of showing ourselves as aggressively tragic, we can have the love we're afraid to lose. Why aren't we letting ourselves live? We can move forward. We can become someone that we're really proud of. We can get attention for positive things. We can be so secure in ourselves that we don't need a bunch of attention to feel fulfilled in the first place. We can actually be happy with ourselves. We can have people in our lives that we know are there because of mutual love instead of bound to us by guilt or pity. We can be the comforters instead of the comforted. If we could just give ourselves the chance to move on. The historian. When we lose someone, we don't forget it. Our lives enter a new era marked by the absence of someone else, and we scramble to hold on to our memories as the traces of them fade in the passing of time. We don't forget it, even if the world seems to. And because the world seems to, we double down on our preservation of the departed's legacy and memory. We turn our lives into a memorial of the other person's life at our own expense. Love doesn't end with loss. Our love lingers on, even when the object of our love is gone. At one time, we could channel our love into our words and our actions. We were compelled to do it by our love, and even when the people we love pass, we are still naturally compelled to do something. We are compelled to honor their memory. We are compelled to hold on to the little mementos that remind us of how real someone was and is to us. We are compelled to go to the places we used to go together and reminisce on times where we stood in the same place and saw the same sights. We are compelled to hold on to every word that a person has said. There are so many things that we've already forgotten because we took them for granted back before we lost them, and now that they're gone, we are compelled to make sure that those moments that we kept are etched into our minds. Especially as we try to navigate life with the pain of loss, it is normal to revisit all of those memories, great and small, profound and mundane. It's a sad process. No matter how happy the memory, we are looking back on it with the understanding that things will never be the same again. We will yearn, and we will hurt, and we will regret, and honor, and imagine, and joke, and feel lost. We will dream, and we will wake up sad. We will cry, and sometimes we will laugh through the tears. We will go through our daily routines so robotically that we forget that things have changed, and we will suddenly remember, and the wound on our heart will hurt anew. We will have moments where we pause and the new habits we make suddenly feel surreal and wrong, like we're living in an alternate universe, like we're stuck in a storyline we weren't supposed to be in, like we don't belong in this world without them. We will have days where we lose car keys and forget appointments, and the only thing we can remember is that person and their absence. Nonetheless, we can stabilize eventually, and we will be able to really smile again. We will have good days and bad days, and some days of the year may always be bad days to us. This is mourning, and we need to allow it to run its course. But sometimes we don't allow it. We can't. It isn't enough to collect the souvenirs of our time with someone. It isn't enough to remember the things that they said, because those things are only relevant to us. They only remind us. What souvenir will remind the world? We decide that we will be that memento, the memorial that reminds the world of the one we love. The world will look at us and say, they used to be like that, but they've changed ever since so-and-so died. We decide that if we stay sad, and if we don't allow ourselves to escape our negative thoughts, and if we allow them to color the way that we see the world, then people won't forget the ones we loved. We refuse to move on because moving on is too much like forgetting. We go out of our way to rekindle our pain so that we can still feel that the other person is tangible somehow. But we don't need to mourn forever. Just because we have days where we can smile again and be happy again doesn't mean that we've forgotten. There is no need to feel guilty for smiling again, no matter what our relationship was with the dearly departed. The pain we feel when we lose someone isn't the only impact that they've had on us and on the world around us. We always carry bits and pieces of the people we love with us. It shows in the phrases we use when we speak, the food that we eat, the clothes that we wear, the pauses we take when we walk through familiar places, the songs that move us, the certain scents that we inhale that we can't quite put our finger on but seem to inexplicably transport us to another moment in time. And we find that there are more little reminders than we ever realized. The habits that we picked up from them are a real part of us now. The way that we think is molded by them. They are so tangible. Their influence is inescapable. Maybe it's too subtle for the world to immediately notice. Maybe it's too subtle for us to recognize. But we are made of the little things that we pick up from the people around us, and without even trying, we are the proof of the bonds that we have with others. The same things that make mourning so hard for us are the same things that assure us that no one is ever truly forgotten. There are a million little ways that they've changed us that are so ingrained that not even death can take that away from us. There is no need to perpetuate mourning for the sake of memorializing someone, because forgetting was never an option. There is no need to tear ourselves apart in an effort to keep their memories alive. Even if our mind forgets, our life doesn't. We don't need to try so hard. But not every historian is a faithful historian. It is a fact that many have changed history in order to tell the story that they wanted to tell. There are things that we don't want to remember, that we wish no one would remember. It is common practice to not speak ill of the dead, and while it's a good philosophy to have, sometimes there are negative things that must be said or at least acknowledged. Because of this philosophy, we sometimes feel like we're doing something wrong when we have any negative thoughts regarding people we've lost. We have this idea in our heads that a mourner should always think the best, but that mindset can be damaging to us. No matter how different the present is from the past was real. People are not perfect. It's okay to admit that things weren't always sunshine and rainbows with someone. No relationship is. It's okay to admit that a relationship was complicated. Many relationships are complicated. It's okay to have mixed feelings. It's okay to not miss everything about someone. It's even okay to feel relieved. It may sound cruel to say these things, and maybe they aren't things to say to everyone. Again, discretion is important, and it's okay to let people continue to think the best as long as it isn't hurting us. We don't need to advertise everything that happened, but we do need to admit to what happened, at least to ourselves. We need to acknowledge our own feelings, or we aren't going to find closure. We can't lie to ourselves forever. What happened, happened, and whitewashing the past and invalidating our heartache is just going to make us feel worse. At any rate, it's okay to remember some things and to forget some things. It's okay to hate some changes and enjoy other changes. It's okay to do all of these things at the same time. It's okay to just live and stop thinking so hard about what our actions mean for someone else's memory. It's okay to just live and feel and get better. The vigilante. A vigilante is defined as a member of a volunteer committee organized to suppress and punish crime summarily, as when the processes of the law are viewed as inadequate. We too, as vigilantes, pursue our ideal of justice in situations that we don't feel are being properly addressed. Our trauma has gone unpunished, and we decide to handle the injustice ourselves. We don't wait for God to give our abusers the fruits that they sow, nor do we ask Him to. We take matters into our own hands. The problem is, we don't know what justice is. We have an idea of what we think should happen, and we enforce that idea, no matter how far from the mark it is. We don't consult God or godly counsel to figure out the correct way to deal with ourselves and those we accuse. We don't know how to properly distribute the liability or how to interpret evidence, and we make decisions according to our poorly framed definition of justice instead of the informed balance of mercy and consequence that God ordains. Our justice isn't blind in that it executes soundly without discrimination, but it is indiscriminately blind. It is ignorance. Our subjective justice, with ourselves at the center of it as anything from a paragon to a pariah, is a loosely conjoined hodgepodge of standards which fluctuate with our pain levels and with our self-esteem. We don't have a good sense of who is really at fault to begin with. As I addressed earlier, we may heap the blame on our abusers, or we place it on ourselves. We may judge innocent people to be perpetrators and guilty people to be mere bystanders. We may put God Himself on trial for what we consider to be gross negligence. We don't have a good sense of proportionate retribution either. We dole out exile and court-ordered support in the same breath to the same party. We shorten and reinstate restraining orders arbitrarily. We extort people for more than they owe, all by our feelings. Any deliberation is emotional rather than rational. Any verdict is impulsive, and our punishments are inconsistent and subject to change. We may literally try to punish an abuser, whether through physical or psychological assault or through verbalization of our hatred. I don't suggest that our abusers are above prosecution. God may have mercy to cover sins, but He doesn't always cover the worldly consequences of sin. God is still merciful to a man behind bars suffering the consequences of his crime, just as He was able to have mercy on Adam and Eve's death-stained souls after the exile from Eden. While God does want us to forgive our offenders, that doesn't mean we forfeit our legal rights, and in a way, it is our duty to prevent anyone else from becoming a victim to an unrepentant abuser. The lives of innocents are more important than the freedom of a criminal. Still, even though we may literally press charges against an abuser, we don't decide the verdict or the sentence, and it's the same way outside of a court of law as well. It is not our place to exact justice. We should be able to tell God about it and let Him take it from there. We should be able to trust in his decisions enough so that even if he decides to withhold punishment, we can be at peace knowing that we will be kept safe. We may punish those around us for their negligible role in our trauma. We demand some emotional compensation from them. We sentence them to community service for life. We forbid them from carrying weapons, and our definition of a weapon is anything that we think looks like it can be a threat in a given moment. Tones, words, contrary opinions, anything. We force them to coddle us at all times. It isn't fair to them, and it's exhausting for us. We bar ourselves from living a peaceful life because we are constantly trying to hold them prisoner to our often random and sometimes contradictory demands. And our demands are contradictory sometimes, because we don't even know what we want from them. We are angry that they leave us alone when we're the ones pushing them away. We are angry that they can't mind their own business when we obviously want them to ask what's wrong. Our volatile expectations can never be met, and it just adds more stress to them and to ourselves. If we could just forgive them, or give them the benefit of the doubt, or not blame them in the first place, we wouldn't be constantly wearing ourselves out trying to enforce today's definition of penance. We could come to terms with our own emotional turmoil and admit that we're struggling. We could talk things out and understand each other better, and try to put everything back together again. We may try to punish God. We should bring our burdens to him, but we don't. We pull away from God so that we're too distant to hear him or to feel him. We avoid him, ignore him, shake our fists at him, discredit him, insult him. We reject every helping hand that he extends us, and we fail to appreciate that the hand that we bite still keeps trying to feed us. We may even openly rebel against him. We force God to watch as we desecrate ourselves, his own creation, and we're quick to remind him that we still blame him for our lowly state and our bad behavior. In our anger, we make it loud and clear that we don't trust in him. One would think, in theory, that a saint could take a storm better than a sinner. That's true to an extent. The Holy Ghost makes things that a man could never shoulder on his own bearable. Nevertheless, when some trauma happens, when God-fearing Job loses his livestock and children and health in spite of his righteousness, it can be harder for the saint to accept. Jesus didn't say that the rain falls on the just and the unjust for the sake of the unjust. The unjust expect it to rain. He said it for the sake of the just, knowing that they would struggle to accept the rain. A saint asks questions that a sinner wouldn't ask, like, why am I being punished if I haven't done anything wrong? Why did this happen to me if I was in the will of God? Why does God want to hurt me like this for no reason? A saint can take things personally in a way that a sinner cannot. A saint can become disillusioned in a way that a sinner cannot. And when we as saints become angry with God, it's messy. There's so much internal conflict between the faith we know and the pain we feel, the righteousness we strive for and the bitterness we hold. We can be anything from passive-aggressive to accusatory to rebellious to completely unable to trust God. In fact, most of what I've written so far stems from this one central premise. We are trying to handle our pain ourselves in any and every ineffective and horrible way that we can because we don't know how to trust God. We don't trust him with our safety. We don't trust him with our emotions. We don't trust him with our futures, our hearts, our souls. We try to hide our corpse from God because we don't trust him to properly interpret the crime scene or to help us readjust to this new life. A part of us may understand that God holds our world in his hands, but that same part is outraged at the tragedy that played out in those hands. I said earlier that sometimes things just happen. I do feel like this is an important thing to tell ourselves so that we can stop blaming ourselves, and even so that we can stop blaming others. But the phrase carries an implication that is perhaps harder for us to swallow than just taking the blame. Sure, sometimes things just happen to us, but nothing just happens with God. If we don't have an understanding of the true nature of life and mortality, the same phrase that absolves our guilt incriminates God. Does God deserve our ire? God isn't the one that assaulted us or berated us or terrified us. God wasn't the one that wounded us. But he's the one who let it happen, isn't he? He's the one who let us taste pain. Why does God allow suffering? Our suffering is and has always been just a far-flung consequence of the original sin. At the dawn of mankind, we traded peace for the knowledge of good and evil, and consequently, for death. We didn't need to know evil, but now that knowledge of evil is a part of our DNA. Evil is always at the door. We didn't need death, but now we have millions of different roads that lead to it. Man created a world of pain and death, and we are all in danger of perpetrating evil, or of being dealt an evil hand by another, or simply dying. In addition, just as there was a serpent in the beginning striving for the downfall of man, there is still a devil working against us today. Spirits don't die, and the same adversary that brought Job to ruin is still walking to and fro over the earth. Although I'd go so far as to say that most of the things that we go through aren't targeted attacks of the adversary, it is certainly a possibility. Both the fall of man and the agendas of hell aren't God's fault. God is love, and mutual love requires agency for both parties. Man chose this world of suffering with his God-granted freedom of choice. And while it isn't the ideal world, God has always extended mankind ways to alleviate our suffering throughout the ages. Life is not great, but life would be even worse without God's constant work. He cares about every person on earth, and we are arrogant to believe that we are able to criticize God as though we were a peer or a superior. Can we really even comprehend him on a level at which we can understand his actions? We can't. We can't even comprehend man's actions. We are given some insight into God's motives, though. For I know the thoughts that I think toward you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end. If we could just have some clarity and recognize that God can and will take care of us, we could arrive at the peaceful, expected end that God gave to us. And maybe we can sort of accept the fact that we live in a dark world and that there's no one left to blame. Maybe we can accept that God didn't traumatize us. But still, why didn't he save us? Why should we trust God now if we couldn't trust him back then? If he loves us, then why did he allow that to happen to us? If God cares about the widows, why does he allow them to become widows? If Jesus loves the little children, why do the children still get molested? Why does he spend more time valuing the broken instead of preventing them from breaking? Why does he calm some storms and let others devastate us? Why did we have to be born into a world like this in the first place? Only God knows the answers to those questions, and we'll never learn the answers if we continue to treat God as an enemy. Until we can find a place where we can interact with God with an open heart, we're never going to find the answers that will allow us to fully understand the entirety of our situations and how it factors into our current lives, because answers only come through a relationship with God. Even if we need to ask God to help us believe, we need to allow ourselves to be vulnerable enough before God to still believe that he has our best interests at heart, whether he is exacting or withholding judgment against those that hurt us. And we need to allow him to make us new again in the face of excruciating change.